Well, this is a bit of an honour here to have these three remarkable people joining us to continue the discussion about how you create the conditions for creativity to flourish. I'm delighted to welcome Lorna Ross, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at VHI Health and Wellbeing, and she's also involved in the Big Life Fix series, which you can maybe tell us about. I'm delighted Leonard Hobbs is a colleague of mine at Trinity, formerly of Intel, where he was Director of Research, and we were involved in a big collaborative research project with Intel many years ago, and he used to scare me when we met, you know. And now he's a colleague, you know. And finally, JP Donnelly, who I've met before at the Docky Book Festival, who's Group CEO of Ogilvy in Ireland and Head of Country for WPP Ireland. So we've got a great panel from, you know, three different but intersecting worlds. And we're going to kick off, I think, Leonard, you're going to kick off on the subject of how to make creativity flourish.
Okay. Thanks, Ian, and thanks indeed for the invite to speak. I must say I feel like a little bit of an imposter in meeting the people, certainly who've been presented right today. It's been a fascinating day so far. So I'd like to start with a story, and once the slide moves, I can tell the story. So I can't speak without PowerPoint. It's something that's I've spent too long on Intel. I have to have PowerPoint for me to be able to speak. It actually makes relationships very difficult. But let me start. Here it is anyway. So the story is about, take it back over 150 years ago, when President Abraham Lincoln was shot or assassinated in the US. It took 12 days for the news to reach London. So it was a time when the US, which was an emerging economy at the time, was desperate to connect to the rest of the world. It was essentially isolated. And along came a guy called Cyrus Field. He was a young entrepreneur. He had made his fortune by the time he was 34. And he came up with the idea, or somebody had suggested him, that you could connect New York to London by a cable, by a cable, using telegraphy. And he thought it could be done. Everybody told me he was mad. Couldn't be done. You couldn't possibly put a cable under the ocean. It wouldn't survive. It would be down too deep. Couldn't be done. But as an entrepreneur, he believed it could, and persisted. He raised enormous amounts of money, and about 20% of America's GDP was actually invested in the project. That was the scale of the project, and it failed. First cable failed. He would try it again, and in 1858 it worked. And there was incredible celebrations. There was parades in New York. You see the quote there on the slide about they compared it to Columbus discovering America. And unfortunately, the 1858 cable lasted about 2 weeks, and it burnt out. There was a guy called a doctor who became an engineer, then called electrician, decided that he knew how to improve the signal, and he upped the voltage, and he blew it basically. He blew the wire. So several years later, the American Civil War intervened, and the British took over the whole cable project. Again, enormous investment was put in. And in 1865, which is the picture you're looking at here, this painting, and again, put it in context, this happened in Valentia. The cable was landed in Valentia Island, County Kerry, an island off an island, a few years after the famine. This is the time we're in. And there was no photography, there was only paintings. This is how old, this is how long ago this thing was, and they didn't really understand the technology, but yet they made it work. And America was connected, and after that, it was demonstrated then that the rest of the world could be connected. So Valencia showed what happened in Valencia in County Kerry, showed what could be done, and then the world became a connected place. The same ship was used, incredible, the biggest ship at the time, the Great Eastern, was used to carry one piece of cable, with one wire, 3,000 kilometers long, the biggest ship of its day, and then that ship, captained by an Irishman, Captain Halpin, was then used to connect the rest of the world. So this is what was called the Victorian Internet. And the reason I wanted to just to show today is a number of points. Number one, every time I stand up, I have to talk about the project because I work with the community in Valencia. We're trying to get UNESCO heritage status for the project. But the second thing, I think it's an incredible example of where somebody with a vision works with a team of people, a diverse team of people, to make something happen. It's never about one person. It's about multiple people working together to achieve these incredible visions or these great challenges. I'll have to apologise to the females in the audience. There were no females involved at the time, and it was all men. And actually, the industry today is still very dominated by men. But at the time, you had Samuel Morse, who was mentioned this morning. He was an artist turned inventor. He came up. He was the person who invented the whole telegraphy technology. Cyrus Field, the entrepreneur. You had Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was an incredible engineer who built the biggest ship in the world. Lord William Thomson became Lord Kelvin of the Kelvin scale. He was a scientist who understood telegraphy, understood electricity, and made the breakthroughs that enabled the 1866 cable to be successful. And finally, James Graves, a local man living in Valencia, running the cable station there, was an incredible innovator. And he figured out how to make the cable viable, how to make it commercially successful, because it was too slow. They couldn't deliver enough messages at the same time. And so he was the innovator. So the innovator, the scientist, the engineer, the entrepreneur, the scientist, and so forth, made this happen. A point that happened though around that time is the world became a flatter place. And that's essentially what we have today as well. The internet today is still under the ocean, by the way. Most people think the internet is delivered in the sky. It's actually delivered under the ocean. 99% of the internet is under the sea still. On fibre optic cables now, not copper cables. But that's still the case. But the world has become a smaller place, and certainly a flatter place. And it's a time when, I know there's been a few commentators right today said, isn't it great that you have technology that people can be creative with? But I'd argue almost the other side, that what we've managed to do is to make it so flat that it's hard to be different. Because everybody's the same now. We've got the same phones, the same Microsoft software, the same data analysis tools. Everybody's the same. And particularly for enterprises, it's very hard to differentiate yourself now that everybody is the same. And that's why creativity becomes so important. The creative person now becomes very important, certainly to enterprises who are in businesses. When they're now hiring people, a lot of industry will tell you that what they're looking for is young, creative, entrepreneurial type people. They're looking for entrepreneurial skills because they're trying to differentiate themselves in a world that is the same. That's why I think creativity is why it's so important. Pablo Picasso said that the chief enemy of creativity is good sense. I'd say the chief enemy of creativity is standardization. In a world where there's a huge pressure to take the cost out of everything, to standardize, to normalize, that's where creativity gets stifled. And it's in that environment where creativity becomes all the more important, and enterprises and industries need to figure out ways of giving space to their employees to make so that they can actually bring forward their creativity. The way you do that then, I put forward, is the following. First of all, it's about people. It's about people who are curious. Then you need to curate it. You need to program how to bring the creativity forward. And finally, I'd say that you need places. That place becomes important. How do you create collisions so that people can actually collide? The different types of diverse teams that you need can collide together as part of this creative process. In the university, it's kind of a boring slide, but in the university the group I run here do this curation. We're very fortunate that we've got some very, very creative people in the university, brilliant people like Ian and so forth. So we're very fortunate to have people like that. But then what we bring the curation. We build the programs, we find the funding. When the research is done and the outputs are determined, we'll start the companies up, we'll do the spin-outs, we'll license the technology, we'll protect the idea through patenting. And then we'll engage with industry so that the idea can actually be transferred out to the world and become impactful and become a piece of innovation. So that's the curation piece. The other thing we're doing at the moment as well is become very, very conscious of the fact that we don't really have place. While there is a big university here, there isn't a place to bring people together so that they can have these collisions, where they can have these conversations, where they can have these water cooler moments, so to speak. So we're developing a site that we currently own down at Grand Canal Dock, which is just at the interface there of Pierce Street and Grand Canal. There's a site there that Trinity's owned since 1999. So we're redeveloping it currently, and the first thing we're going to put there is an innovation hub. We're redoing a facility. Here's an artist's impression of it that will house 400 entrepreneurs, about 100 companies, and hopefully as well bringing in the creativity piece of it. The Lyric Theatre which would be a neighbour of ours at the time. See if we can bring all that together and create these kind of collisions that can create the kind of grand challenges and achieve the great goals that were achieved in Valencia back in 1866. And with that, I'll finish.
Thank you very much, Leonard. Thank you. Lorna, would you like to kick off? And
Yeah, I have no slides.
no,
I didn't do my homework.
no, that's we don't need slides.
So I guess we had chatted briefly, and there's probably a couple of different. I mean, I come from a design discipline, and so I thought I would kind of think about what kind of creativity means. Trying to kind of, in a nutshell, I guess, having been trained to be a creative. I mean, maybe having been born with certain aspects of it, maybe, but kind of refined it. And I think the thing I'm most aware of when I work with other creatives or good designers is that there's a really kind of internal and external aspect to creativity, and kind of, I think first internally, it links to imagination. I think that that if you are able to tap into and kind of really access your imagination, I think, characteristics of people who are really creative, and I think there's a kind of a really elaborate and kind of established capacity to kind of inhabit your imagination and kind of like, I see it as being able to almost rehearse and experiment internally first. And so a really creative brain is one that is can kind of hold a level of complexity and kind of explore it very vividly. Mm. And then it becomes an external act. So I think and often the external act is much more talked about because it's much more evident and it's kind of witnessed. And I think it's become a real spectator sport as well. But I think there's a really interesting, my experience of being a creative is that you tend to have a very, your internal landscape is one that you can kind of really navigate, and you often almost run simulations in your head and can kind of extrapolate ideas and explore two different ideas at the same time and kind of assess them. And you have this vivid internal landscape in I think that then it becomes part of an external kind of practice. But I think the internal is less talked about than the external. I think so there's aspects, back to the kind of theme of the panel around, can you create the circumstances? The kind of internal one is that it's a bit like I don't want to mention meditation, but it's a practice that you have to do. It's the kind of solo act. And then there's so many other practices or kind of rituals involved in the external, which is more around collaboration. It's more around using tools. It's more around, building to think, building to resolve problems. But there's this internal aspect of it that you kind of have to practice alone, I think.
It's fascinating. Just to follow, before I come to JP, I think there is some evidence that creativity is associated with the use of visual imagery. And you kept using the words landscapes and simulations. And we do live in a very verbally dominated world, and there's a lot of evidence that particularly in very young children, before they go to school, think largely in images. And once you start strengthening the verbal systems, it actually inhibits these non-verbal thought processes, which are not just entirely visual, they're also tactile, spatial, auditory. It's a theatre. And your language was just exactly, it just reminded me of that research. So it strikes me that one thing you're saying is you have to find the ways to allow these modes of thought to flourish in individuals and in groups. So we'd love to come back to that. JP, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I feel a little shallow coming from the business side of creativity. Maybe I work in an industry that has, if you take the Dublin community itself, there's about 3,000 people within the square mile here, all from various different disciplines, working in different companies, and artists and scientists as well, maybe with a small s rather than a large s. But bringing them together around a way, it's not just creativity in our industry, it's not sort of just coming up with an aha moment, maybe like you used to see in Mad Men, but it's a much more formalized and professional process to bring people around together, from different disciplines together. And I think that's something as well that you can learn about. We often say in our industry, give me the freedom of a tight brief. And that's a very difficult challenge. You know, it's easy to have, I've got to, you know, come up with some creative idea, here's an issue, come up with a creative idea. It's actually the distillation process, the involving and the inputs that come to that process that helps get to that kernel of thought that sometimes is the most insightful thing that liberates it. And David Ogilvy, who was one of our founders in my company, used to say, unless your brand is built on a big idea, it'll pass like the ship in the night. And so there's a lot we can learn from that notion of having a big idea. Now, the digital world has sort of changed everything, changed all of our businesses and both different tensions and opportunities. So in some ways, sometimes it's made us a little bit more transactional, but it also gives an opportunity to be quite transformational. And we have, again, tried to capture that idea of transformation and turn ideas into ideals.
Sorry, wasn't ideal.
Into ideals.
Ideals.
Put an L at the end.
Yeah.
Put an L at the end. And I suppose that's embedding purpose and really trying to understand the role of purpose as a means to integrate and pull people together. And often we find there's this very interesting sweet spot between understanding the truth of your business or your brand and the cultural tension that's out there that exists. And when you find those two places and you try to put them together, you find a position and opportunity for creativity. So that's kind of how the business works, and there's lots we can learn from that. But then the second side, I think, is to think about how your business operates. And I think this is a real make or break for any company is around its culture. And it's the great line that we're near a business school, it's culture eats strategy for breakfast, and there's never a more truer word. So setting that cultural environment for creativity is really important and very easily written away. So a lot of our businesses were run by entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs had a passion, and then suddenly it became more formalized into professional management. And professional management is run by numbers and financial spreadsheets and things like that. So that trying to tap into and sustain that culture and sustain those standards, maybe not about because also as it becomes standardization, is trying to create that standard. So that comes down to the individual, the leadership. And then that's the real moment of truth, is kind of the leaders that are in our business. And you need the mavericks, you need the people who are disgruntled and want to make change happen, and they need to be able to flourish in that environment. You've got to be able to let them come into your culture and live in your culture, despite the fact that you're trying to run it with a set of rules and boundaries. So I think that's another area that is worth looking at. We often have people called creative directors, so that they tend to be sort of maverick and quite volatile people, but they are able to do it in a sort of a complex, safe environment because we've established the right environment, the right process. So I think that's maybe the learning.
That's so very interesting to hear about the mechanics of navigating this permissive culture that allows kind of delinquent behaviour.
Believe me, it's very hard to manage.
Have you had any experience of that, of kind of managing necessary delinquency?
Yeah. Lots. So I've run design studios, and so similar, but probably more from the designer running the designers, which is a bit like kind of. There's this, it's hard to be a creative running creatives. It's often easier, and I think. I think design has become, we've talked about this, design's become a real commodity. And so, an awful lot of design inside organizations and like in consulting, or essentially it's part of, the origins of, for me, and I know the word creative and I'm using the word design, but for me, the origins of the creative industries is, it's linked largely to manufacturing. And so it's like, the Industrial Revolution and how you mass produce, and it's a lot around consuming and a lot about, the kind of brands and selling, and it's about creating aspiration. So you can't sell, if someone's already got something and you want to sell them a new car /phone / vacuum cleaner, you have to somehow convince them that the one they have is not good enough. And so there has to be this sense that you couldn't be, you could have a much nicer vacuum cleaner, Ian, if you deserve it, So it is, I think I'm aware of the kind of design industry being linked to industries where there's an economic model about kind of creating. I think there's an awful lot of, working in innovation, there's a lot of things about toxic innovation where you're thinking about just generating churn for the sake of it. And so I've run design studios inside large organizations where it is a real commodity and it is linked back to clients and it is about their kind of growth. And it is about, there's an economic model around design that is about obsolescence, like designing for obsolescence and stuff, and people are addressing that now. And I think, so you have to, so what happens with designers, you bring like young designers, they're very ideological, and an awful lot of organizations, what they try and do is, big design firms tend to try and compensate in lots of ways where they allow people to do kind of pro bono work, or they kind of work on kind of, non-for-profit projects every now and again as a kind of counterpoint to the stuff they're doing with industry. And I think that's really tough. And I think that, I ended up working in healthcare a lot, and that felt a lot more that felt better running design studios inside healthcare, because I think it is, there's a kind of an inherent, design is about problem solving, creativity is about problem solving, and it's very, very hard to kind of put boundaries. And I think that having a really good brief is good, but I think putting boundaries around creativity is that it's really counterintuitive. And I think it's a bit like turning on an aspect of someone and then turning it off again. And I think that kind of the nature of how it's a very emotive act being creative, and it's very hard to kind of switch it on and switch it off. And I think you really struggle with that cadence, like an industry cadence or a manufacturing cadence to producing something when it's a very emotive act. And I think it is really challenging to kind of run creatives. We tend, and also I've seen things like, they kind of burn out really quickly, or you have to move them around an awful lot, or you have to give them time off projects. Working in healthcare, a lot of creatives are very empathetic, so it's a big part of the imagination is empath. And so the impact of working in healthcare and being a creative is that they actually get really, really burdened emotionally by the topic. And so there's this trade-off always between, you want the empath working, understanding the patient experience, but then you're watching the impact of them emotionally because they are that person. So I think managing creatives inside industries is you have to protect them. That was discussed earlier on, I think, in the last panel about protecting their well-being. I think that they are raw, and that's why they're so good at what they do. But it is very, very hard to run, and because it is a commodity. People want to put it back in its box, and they want to put a price on it, and they want to sell it to somebody.
JP, I was interested in you talking about the ideas to ideal.
Yeah.
And the question of values.
Yeah.
And, the value of values, if you like. So I'm just thinking, a question for all of you. Given the global challenges facing humanity, is there a virtue in saying, well, we design for, yes, the purposes of our design is not just to sell a new product, but to sell a new product that consumes less energy, or to sell a product that has this real, genuine, not superficial benefit to the world. Now, of course, that, and there are some corporations coming on board with it, that, it's not all about shareholder value as the ethic. But that's a tension, because in the end, the bottom line is about shareholder value. So I'd love to hear all of you just talk about that tension between.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what it is. More now, obviously, in a digital world, your brand and your business can become disintermediated overnight. So you have to have a purpose embedded into your business. So you have to understand, and you can't just make that up, or it's not a CSR initiative that you can just tag on to your operation. It has to come from the very core, the very soul of your business. And so you have to really find that purpose and really crystallize that purpose. And by getting to that place of purpose, then actually you can talk to multiple audiences. You can actually be more inclusive and more involving, and reach out and create more discussion, more debate, and as I say, involve people in your brand. And we've seen, the likes of Unilever with Lifebuoy, for example, the soap bar, talk to the world about how to wash your hands with the very famous campaign about staying alive till you're 5, which was about for children, helping them to wash their hands in developing countries, which was something they weren't doing, and as a result there was death emerging. So obviously a pretty tense issue, but by washing your hands and clean and having an understanding of clean behaviour, that you could actually change the way people think and work and live. And so marketing and communication can play a very powerful role, but more importantly, the business can play a very powerful role. And in so doing, then, you not just only reward the shareholder, but you reward all the stakeholders. So I think that's a really important step. And you can't get away with it now in the digital world. So, you're always, if you're not appealing to all your stakeholders and recognizing their role in your business, you're going to have trouble with them. So you have to have something that...
Like Facebook has had,
Facebook has had, exactly, and many other organizations who
Yes.
have neglected, who maybe have just been one-dimensional.
Or Shell, for instance, just recently.
We'll have a few coming out in there, have been asked questions, and some were slow to respond in the Ukraine situation. And this is a moment of truth for a lot of these organizations. So getting to that role, what is my purpose, is really important.
I think it's very difficult because ultimately, the product that you make, people need to buy. People want to buy it, and if the people don't value the effort you're making in producing that product, whether it's low energy, whatever, you're not going to sell it. We had back in Intel days, we had a scenario where the CEO at the time was actually very caught up on this whole idea of conflict metals. Now, a lot of the metals that are used in all your devices, your semiconductor devices in your phones, can use some rare metals, titanium, tantalum, gold, that kind of thing. And he went on this campaign to ensure that all the metals that Intel was using were coming from non-conflicted countries. On a huge campaign, spent huge amounts of money on it. And in the end, and they even tested putting a sticker on the laptop to say it was conflicted metals. And in the end, they didn't do it. And they didn't, having done all the investment, they didn't do it because the consumer didn't care. So consumers need to care. So it doesn't matter how well-intentioned a corporate can be. If consumers don't care about something, you're not going to sell it. And that ultimately is the driver, because it is in the end it is about the shareholder. Unfortunately, that's just reality.
Yeah. Values, Lorna. In healthcare, it's kind of easier in a sense, isn't it? To bring the values into your brand.
It's amazing to kind of, I love working in healthcare, and I've been lucky to recruit a lot of designers into healthcare, and I worked, as you know, but some people may not know, I worked at the Mayo Clinic for about 9 years and ran a big design studio, and it was really interesting to kind of bring creatives through. What's curious is also it's a scientific community, it's evidence-based, and so there were some real bumps in terms of bringing a community in and a way of working and a way of talking about what we saw. So our job was to kind of reflect the patient experience and was to be not a proxy, but was to really speak on behalf of the patient. And, an awful lot of what we did was it's quite intuitive, and so we ended up having to kind of adapt our language to kind of sound a bit more scientific. And so we often kind of became too concerned with the kind of pseudoscience of design. So we kind of came up with phrases and terms, the way we talked about stuff. We actually adapted the way we design's really good at map making, so we talk about making the invisible visible, and so an awful lot of things in really opaque, complex systems are really invisible. Like everyone kind of knows they're there, but no one can agree what they look like, and so we just always made maps and charts and stuff. And we tried so hard to have a kind of taxonomy and a kind of language about how we quantified and have artifacts and proof, because it's evidence and proof, because we were surrounded by world-class scientists. And so it was a real journey to go on. And actually what happened was I felt like we became so analytical. I remember distinctly, I'm not going to take too much time, but I remember meeting this young graphic artist who was doing, I don't know how many people know graphic novels where they're like really beautiful hand-drawn. And he wanted to come and work in the studio, and he was a friend of a woman I worked with. He was a nephew. And he brought his portfolio, and I was like, graphic novels, I'm not quite sure. And then that same afternoon, saw a presentation we had done, and we had abstracted this idea of the patient into these little kind of icons, where we had this very kind of sanitized version of the kind of human experience. And so I went back and I hired him, and I said, I'm just going to bring you in for a couple of months, and I want you to kind of almost re-inhabit this idea of the patient, because we've become so clinical and we've become so kind of, we're very scientific, and it's very much about quantities and numbers and kind of, we had gone native. I talked about going native, and so he came in and did these beautiful line drawings and really captured the emotion of patients. So it's an amazing environment to work in, but it's still finding that overlapping language, and we indexed too far into being really like scientific art or scientific design and had to come back. So it's, again, collaborations are challenging, and I think that there's no one way to collaborate. I think it's a really organic. You have to be, you just have to keep paying attention to what's working. When you're trying to collaborate, it's tough.
I think it's just like any. I talk about branding in our world, but brands actually, any organizational entity or any person is a brand, and so actually being able to define your values is fundamental to it. And you have sort of rational values and you have emotional benefits that come with that. So it's trying to actually translate who you are, what you stand for. That happens for all of us as individuals, but it also happens for any type of entity that exists. So I think it's a very important and critical exercise for anyone trying to undertake a creative process.
Wow, it's a fascinating idea that everyone is a brand.
Yes.
I mean, there's a whole. The risk there is you end up imprisoning yourself in a narrative.
You can do, but you can also be very clear about what you stand for. So and being true to yourself as well. So it's getting to your truth and what you stand for, rather than trying to be all things to all people, because that sometimes happens us in society these days. So.
But I mean, taking that thought that everyone's a brand, is it possible to foster? So one approach to running a design studio, or you create people with proven ability to generate new ideas, and then the challenge is to maintain an environment that keeps them happy and productive, because happiness and creativity go together. It's if you're unhappy, you're not going. Sometimes, yeah. But is it possible to increase the level of creativity across the board, and not rather than just put all your money in a few creatives, a minority of creatives? Or is that disrupting to an organization? You want people who just want to do their job, and you want the majority of people to do their job and not be worrying about fancy ideas. What is there any virtue on the? I mean, one of the themes of this Creative Brain Week is that not necessarily in work, but everyone has the capacity to be creative now.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely it can do. I mean, again, it comes back to the culture of the company and what how you set yourself up. But you take a business like Pixar, which it's every facet of it. It's down to the way they work and their attitudes, their philosophies, their principles. They've defined them. They've thought these through, and they've put in place creative mechanisms that work across the organization. They don't just. It's not just about the creative people. It's the whole ecosystem that understands how to work to this way of working. And when you start to lose that is when sort of the standardization piece that Leonard talks about, our commoditization, comes in, and it's how do you work your way back out of that again? And that can be where life repositions you, or the world changes around you, and you've got to reconnect yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing, is to watch out for that and stay ahead of that all the time. So staying relevant all the time is really important.
Yeah.
So you always have a customer at the end of the day, or a consumer of some kind. It's it's not a shopper, but it's a consumer or a customer. So it's actually staying relevant to them. And if the organization can stay relevant to that end consumer, now you can sustain yourself.
I think it's actually a question of diversity, to answer your question. I think it's companies are realizing that diverse workforces are much more effective. Again, unfortunately, I think we're inclined to standardise the diversity thing by gender diversity, and that we're putting things in boxes. But I would say that not everybody's a brand. I think everybody is diverse.
Yeah.
Everybody's different, and if you can appreciate that and value that in a company, then it works.
Yeah.
But it's this sort of this boxing people into different kind of categories. Is where you have these boundaries where I think things don't gel together then.
I think there's evidence that people who have lived in two different cultures are objectively more creative than people who have lived in a single culture, because they have this capacity to shift perspective from the two different cultural views.
Which is often a problem in Ireland because we live on an island.
Yeah,
And it's becoming less of an issue because we're becoming more multicultural. But I say to young people all the time, get off the island.
Yeah.
Period. And then come back. But it's just not healthy to live on the island.
No.
All the time.
I think there's, most people know the term design thinking, which is, I think that's an attempt to your point, Ian, is about how people want to make everyone, or there's a sense that kind of, I'd say as organizations, it's not like, there's aspects of competitiveness where they realize, okay, we can drive efficiencies and we can get cheaper and we can get faster and we can get more efficient. But the edge is coming with the unpredictable. Like, how do you stay? And I think understanding if you're, being kind of competitive in a market is maybe being unpredictable. And so, how do you bring unpredictability into a robust culture that is a corporate culture that has to run like a well-oiled machine? And where do you bring it in? Do you bring in the kind of group of exotics that you lock in a basement somewhere, feed them pizza, and all the cliches around? So, and I think that was always like, I've worked in a lot of research labs where the people outsourced creativity because it was a bit high risk and they didn't want people knowing that they were investing in it, and I think then design thinking came along and it became part of big corporations, a bit like it was a training, and there's a massive industry, right? It's like the biggest industry about how to teach people to think like designers, not to be designers but to think like them. And I've done more design thinking than I want to admit, and I know that I understand the business of design thinking, and I think it's used a lot around collaboration. I think it's I think people bring in design thinking when they want people to be collaborative. I think to your point, Leonard, about collaboration across silos, and it's not really about the individual thinking, it's about group think. It's about creating some kind of shared language where there's some kind of consensus, or there's some kind of generative process where divergent opinions can converge, where consensus, where it still kind of feels good, and there's some buy-in. And so I think design thinking is typically promoted as being a group activity versus the individual. So I think there's been so much experiments in terms of how do you kind of propagate this idea of creativity across organizations, and what's the mechanisms that you do it with? Is it the unique little group, the kind of niche?
And there are probably, I imagine between the three of you, you can identify fairly readily a set of things that would inhibit design thinking or creativity in an organization. Would you care to identify some of the villains here? Yeah.
Well, I actually always believe that the role of the board in setting the tone is really important. That they often again come back to, are they representing the shareholder, or do they work for the company and all of its stakeholders? So they set the tone, the entrepreneur and the leader. So I think it's again, are these inhibitors or enablers? Money can be an inhibitor, but it can also be a very powerful motivation. So you take cost out. Sometimes the best creativity comes from actually coming up with that. What is the invention or the innovation? Because the situation now, again, how you frame that challenge is really important. So it's not just a case of we're cutting costs. So it's regressive and reductive. It's actually, let's come up with new ways of doing this, more imaginative ways. So we think about that in different ways. So I think those are just a couple of things that would help.
I think a lack of paranoia in a company is not a good thing.
A lack of paranoia.
A lack of paranoia.
You need a bit of paranoia.
You need a bit of paranoia, I think you do. I think this, Andy Grove, who's an internal CEO, he talked about only the paranoid survive. But another aspect that can kill companies as well is companies that are single product and believe in the product, and the product's going to last forever. The famous one, of course, is Kodak. Kodak didn't see the digital camera coming. And we had, again, a thing in Intel where the previous CEO used to talk about the creosote bush. That was only one product and would kill everything around it. There's a great story actually about IBM. When IBM invented the PC, what they did was that they were a mainframe company. They were making mainframes. They were making a lot of money from mainframes. And Apple came with this disruptive thing called the PC. And IBM's board said, well, that's not going to take off. We can ignore that. And there's one particular IBM employee, I don't know his name, but he said, look, give me a team and let me go down to Florida. And he did. He went down to Florida, got away from the mothership, and created the IBM PC. And then got the Microsoft operating system cheaply from this guy that he met in Seattle, and became the IBM PC. and this incredible success story because it got away from the mothership and got away from the creosote bush killing the ideas. That's often what happens in big corporates, that they're so focused on my product will last forever.
I can think of a few creosote bushes around this campus.
There's a forest of them actually.
We won't open that Pandora's box.
Lorna, you were going to say, yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with all of those, and I there's certainly my experience in things that can really interrupt or kind of paralyze the kind of creativity inside organizations is that I found that there's two different types of creativity. Generally, there's really lots, but there's this kind of additive where there's you create stuff, you create novelty, you create something new, and then there's this kind of abstractive kind of creativity, which could be called destructive, where you make redundant things. So by thinking radically, you challenge an awful lot of the traditional thinking, and you actually point to the redundancy, and you offer an alternative. And I've always seen people have a really high tolerance for the additive, where they're like, we'll just make space for more stuff, and it's not really challenging anybody and everyone. So if you have organizations where people are really invested and they kind of applaud and celebrate, and I've seen this because, again, when we were working in healthcare, we kept doing in Mayo was saying, stop doing all these things. And they're like, how dare you tell us to stop doing things? We thought you'd make, what's the output? And how is there evidence that you're creating value? You need to point to something. And we're like, well, we're not going to create more complexity in an already polycomplex system. We want to think about efficiencies. So this reductive, abstractive aspect of tolerance for letting go and acknowledging versus celebrating the additive and the novelty. And I think that organizations that don't know how to really effectively allow innovation to be the creative, to kill off the stuff that is not creating any value, that is really challenging because that becomes an opinion, because people are so invested in things.
It's so interesting. There was a paper in Nature, it was either last year or the year before, on problem solving. And it was kind of, child kind of breaks kind of problem solving, and they showed there was incredible lacuna that people were so unlikely to take away something in order to solve the problem. The inevitable tendency was to add something.
Particularly if you're
to try
being
and solve
watched. If someone's watching you be creative, then you think you have to be like.
Yeah, but even when they're not being,
generative.
but even then, just there's something about taking away that hits some kind of mental barrier, or some heuristic, and saying, well, how can I solve a problem by taking something away? It's like, I have to add to it. And so less is more sometimes.
Very much.
Very interesting. We've got a couple of, if there's any questions either from the multiverse or from the room, we'd be delighted to take them. Yes.
I'm just listening to all of you and reflecting on the talk that was on beforehand. One of the things that I'm finding interesting is that creativity is now being presented in different ways in different organisations. Like JP, I come from a kind of advertising community and design background. So the advertising and design background was very kind of established. Whereas now one of the larger hospitals in Ireland has got a product designer, and it's a designer in residence. And their job is to help problem solve. It's not that the hospital needs a product designer. They need that creativity of thinking. And I'm wondering if you're seeing in all of the different areas that you're working in, that emerge. Sorry, were you able to? I've got a carrying voice. But are you beginning to see that across bigger organisations, bigger brands, the new incubation centre that you're going to have at Trinity, in the likes of EHI, that just that aspect of creativity being an integral part of how organisations have to work? Is that becoming more mainstream?
Well, I mean, I fear in some cases it's not actually. It's been pushed downstairs in lots of ways, and that's the danger of this standardization and commoditization. So that's why I bring it back into the boardroom, and therefore bring it back into the C-suite. And we were discussing this at lunchtime as well, about the need to inject that design thinking philosophy and even practice into the boardroom, and that would actually help start to set the right rhythm and culture into an organisation.
Well, we're smack on. Is there someone? Is another question? Yeah. We're smack on 4 o'clock. I'd really like to thank Lorna, Leonard, and JP for a really interesting, stimulating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And that is, apart if you go, there's the Brain FM going on in the Beckett Theatre, the neurodiverse dance class. I'm not sure, maybe, but then apart from that, we're back tomorrow for the second day of Creative Brain Week. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.